And now in this talk, I will talk about something that's not in the forefront of most people's minds when they think about agent-based modeling, but it's very important. And it's about documentation of agent-based models. And I will in particular talk about the ODD+D standard for documenting and reporting agent-based models. Now, while I will be talking about the ODD+D as an example, I will not so much focus on my largest part of my talk will be about why it's important to somehow properly and accurately document your model more than about the how in the context of the ODD+D, because once you have these kind of standards, it's somewhat straightforward to apply them, I think, especially with the ODD+D, but coming up with these kind of standards and realizing that they are important, I think is the most important step to make. So let me start with highlighting why such standards are useful and necessary in agent-based modeling. And I call this section the problems in implementing simulation models. And just, sorry. Okay. So this is now, if you're interested in more, learning more about this, I highly recommend this paper. It's already a bit older, from 2006 by Ricciardi, Leon Bruni, Sam, and Sonessa, published in the Journal of Artificial Societies and Social Simulation, where they propose their own protocol for agent-based social simulation. So I'm personally I've never used this protocol, as I find other protocols a bit more easy to apply and a bit more useful, but their discussion of why such protocols are useful, I think, is very enlightening and very interesting. So they highlight that agent-based models have solid methodological foundations, but they yield lots of freedom and degrees in freedom in terms of, for example, how you design your model, which elements it has, and how you analyze your model. And these degrees of freedom and this lack of a coherent standard has led to what they call some kind of anarchy in the field when it comes to design and analysis and presentation of models. So, for example, there is no standard classification for the different ways in which agents can exchange information and communicate. There's no standard way to treat the artificial data that the model generates, meaning that every researcher kind of analyzes their model ad hoc. At least that used to be the case without following a standard way of going about that. Then often there are no clear or no straightforward standards for, or at least they are not applied in terms of how the experimental data, so the outcome that the model generates, should be compared with the empirical data that you have for validating your model outcomes. Then the parameter values are sometimes chosen without a proper discussion, so it's not clear why a particular value has been chosen for a certain parameter and not other values. And most importantly, often it's not possible to understand the details of the implementation of an agent-based model just from the verbal description. And I agree with this statement that this makes replication difficult and sometimes impossible, and thereby it violates basic principles of scientific practice, namely that what we do should be, at least in principle, be replicable by other researchers to validate what we have been doing and to confirm the veracity of our models and our results. And then a bit more in detail, there are some pitfalls in describing papers, describing agent-based models, and the main difficulty here is that agent-based modeling is comparatively new, or at least used to be comparatively new. By now it's a bit more established, but mainstream journals often have difficulties accommodating agent-based models or descriptions because they deviate from what has been done before, right? If you have a regression model that you apply to a population level data set like the European Social Survey, there are certain standard templates that you can follow in describing your model, your research and your analysis that you did and the results that you obtained that nobody really questions, right? Because it's so common. But agent-based models deviate from that, or the description of agent-based models deviates from that because, for example, the models that we have typically deviate radically from the existing literature. So we're doing often you're in a situation where you're the first one to apply an agent-based model to a specific research question. Therefore, you cannot really draw on standard templates for describing what you're doing. Then the same goes for the structure of the model. So there are many elements that are essential for a model, but for which there are typically no guidelines for how to report this, whether and how to report this in a journal article, right? So, for example, as you have seen also in this course, treatment of time can be essential for how the model behaves. So, but in a journal, you will rarely see a section that asks you for indicating whether you use discrete or continuous time. Then often it's not required to discuss or specify whether your model is explicitly stochastic or deterministic, how you treat heterogeneity in your model, which are all points that are important for modeling, for agent-based modeling, which are not commonly reported or not at least commonly featured in standard templates for journal articles. And often this leads to a situation where you kind of, so I personally, that's now my personal experience that I also colleagues that I talked to shared is when you try to submit an agent-based model to a mainstream journal, you have to attend to the needs of two audiences at the same time, right? On the one hand, you want to make it understandable and design it in a way, your description in a way that makes it understandable for standard readers of the journal who might not have a background in simulation modeling. But at the same time, you want to satisfy people who know a bit more about agent-based modeling to provide an accurate description of your model and to enable them to replicate your model. And these are two goals that are sometimes really not compatible with each other, right? So often to make it through the review process, especially when you have non-expert reviewers when it comes to simulation modeling, you need to boil it down to have a simple story, to use as few equations as possible, and those equations that you have to explain them intuitively so that people understand what you're doing if they're not used to this kind of method, which then goes at the cost of accuracy, right, and detail. And so I skipped this now because I said that already. So there are some solutions to this problem. The first solution is, I think this should be standard. It's not yet, but many people are arguing for that it should be standard that you publish your code and input data alongside your paper. Because the code of the model is the only way in which the model can be described 100% accurately. Any verbal description of what your model does is only an approximation and therefore might be erroneous and ambiguous. So you might put a lot of effort into describing your model, but still somebody might misunderstand what you're doing. And with the code, you can circumvent these misunderstandings directly showing what you have actually been doing. And there are certain ways for making your code available. For example, a popular platform in the area of agent-based modeling is the ComSysNet or OpenABM, where you find a huge collection of agent-based models using different languages for implementing the models. But the language doesn't really matter, but the focus is here more on agent-based models within this library. Then coming more from computer science or software development, there is GitHub, and I think it's also increasingly used for sharing code for analysis in research. Is GitHub, which is a bit less specialist, more general, which I see increasingly being used also at our institute. Also people who do not necessarily use it for simulation, but for example, writing a piece of code that accesses the Facebook API or Twitter API to extract data. And then there are general databases like the Harvard Dataverse, where you can upload the data for any kind of study that you have conducted. Finding agent-based models here is a bit less common. And then the least recommendable thing to do is publishing code on the publisher's web space, because there might be access restrictions that people, for example, can only download the book if they the code to a paper if they bought access to the book or the journal on the respective journal's web space. Now, the second step that's important is, and next to publishing your code, the problem with publishing your code is that not everybody might be able to read your programming language, right? So I'm not fluent in Python. I get the basic understanding, but checking a model based on Python would be difficult for me, and I might not understand certain things. So there are standards that can be used to give a verbal description of an agent-based model that's more detailed than you would. More standardized than you would provide if you would just write an article for a mainstream journal. And starting from ecology, the ODD standard has been developed, which has later been developed into the ODD+D standard for agent-based models that involve human individuals who make decisions. And it's the ODD comes from the three main elements: overview, design concepts, and details, which has been enriched in the latest iteration with decisions that directly address individual decision-making behavior. And this ODD standard has certain standard elements that are sorted into these three main areas: overview, design concepts, and details. Within these sections, you have smaller subsections, for example, where you describe the purpose of the model, the state variables and scales, and so on and so on. And within each of these sections, you have certain subsections. And the idea is so that you start from such a list like you have here, which gives you all the elements of the standard, starting from overview. So if you write a description based on the standard, your first section would be the overview section, where the first subsection would be purpose of your model. And then you would try to answer these sub-questions. So what's the purpose of the study? What was the goal? Was it a scientific experiment? Was it an illustration? Was it meant for educational purposes? And so on and so on and so on. And you define for whom the model was designed. And now, without going into all the details and all the different questions that you have here, of which there are quite a number of those, I think having such a list ensures that you don't forget important elements of a model that you might ordinarily not think of when describing a model in layman terms, but which would be important for implementing the model. So, for example, is there a collective learning in a model? Can your agents actually learn something? Or is there, no, sorry, where's the point that I, right, so heterogeneity, which is a central feature of agent-based models. And the last point here, heterogeneity, is an explicit element of this description. And the idea is that you always list your answers to each of these elements, or you say something to each of these elements so that people can say, is your model, are your agents heterogeneous or not? Even if they are not, it's important to explicitly state that, because then people know and don't have to figure it out themselves from what you have written. And as I said before, I don't want to go into the details of all the aspects of these standards. You can download the paper here from Environmental Modeling and Software, where you get a detailed example, applied example of how to apply the standard. I just wanted to give you a flavor of what the standard looks like, and how you can, why it's important or beneficial to apply such a standard. And now, one central argument as a last point that's often used against these kind of standards is, yeah, okay, this is a nice standard, and if I write my paper this way, other modelers will understand it, but there's no way that I get the paper published that's written in this way, right? If I would submit this report to journal, it would be rejected because reviewers don't know what to do with it, because it doesn't follow standard protocol. And there, I think a useful approach is to, while you publish the paper with the mainstream description that makes sense in the context of the journal, you also, next to this, publish the model code together with the standardized description, like using the ODD+D protocol on, let's say, OpenABM, so that people who are interested in it can actually access it. The downside of this is that this creates extra work, because you basically have to write the paper twice. Well, it's not exactly the case, because you can largely sample from the main paper in your standard description and expand it a little bit, but it's a bit more work. But in my experience, it's worthwhile, because people want to learn more about your model and want to understand really in detail, benefit greatly from that.